Hello, and welcome to Catholicism in the Car. My name is Parker Zerbal. Trying to start out this podcast here, we are testing different microphone options. I had some headphones, some wireless headphones that were like earbuds, and I tried those last night on a podcast. They worked better than just my phone speaker alone, but this time we're trying some wired headphones with a mic on it to get the mic a little closer to my mouth, and we'll see how this goes. Looking at those sound waves, it seemed as though it would work a little better. So, yesterday we were talking about the three different paradigms for understanding reality. And the three that I listed were solipsism, nominalism, and realism. Initially, we talked about solipsism, which, to review, is the kind of philosophical paradigm that looks at reality and says, all of reality is a figment of my imagination. And really the only thing that I know is that I am thinking. We referenced Rene Descartes, and then there have been some more recent philosophers that have talked about this idea. I'm not sure if any have actually espoused the idea. The second paradigm for reality that we talked about was realism, particularly as articulated by the philosophers Plato and Aristotle. Now, I didn't give much background on Plato and Aristotle. I was kind of assuming people knew who I was talking about, but for those of you who do not, Aristotle is the pupil of Plato, and Plato was the pupil of Socrates. So in timeline order, it would go Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Now, Socrates, we do not have any extant writings that claim to be from his own pen. All that we have about Socrates is written by Plato. Plato wrote mostly dialogues between different characters, whether real or fictional, to discuss various philosophical matters. Now, all three of these characters were ancient Greeks. I believe Aristotle died around the 350s BC, I believe. So that puts Plato slightly older than him, and Socrates slightly older than him. You could probably say Socrates was born at the early 400 BC time period, early 400s, so like 420 maybe, or around 400. I can't remember exactly what the dates are. That brings up another point. This podcast is me totally on the fly. I don't have any notes. I'm basically just going off of everything that I've learned and read over the past number of years in regards to philosophy and theology. So Plato, Aristotle, and then Socrates before both of them. We talked about how Plato's understanding of realism was that there was a realm of the forms that concepts resided in, and everything else gets its substance, you could say, using the Aristotelian word, gets its substance from that realm of the forms. So catness, dogness, individual cats and dogs get their catness and get their dogness from this realm of the forms. Aristotle, on the other hand, thought that concepts were real. These concepts were real, but they resided in the individuals. So dogness does not reside outside of a dog. It resides within the individual dog. But individual dogs share the nature of dogness, the concept of dogness. Okay, same with individual humans, cats, whatever you might say. And then we went on to nominalism, which, as we had said, was proposed very initially by Peter Abelard in the 11th century, and William of Ockham later developed it in the 14th century, the 1300s. He was a pupil of John Duns Scotus, whom I have mentioned in a previous podcast, one on univocity, which you can go back and look at. John Duns Scotus influenced in a lot of ways this guy named William of Ockham. Now, both of these men were Franciscan theologians. Franciscans are a religious order within the Catholic Church, derived from St. Francis of Assisi. Now, William of Ockham was really the first one to kind of popularize or really lay out the ideas that are within the paradigm of nominalism. And as we talked about, nominalism is basically the idea that concepts or ideas do not exist in reality. They only exist by the fact that man gives them names. Hence, nominalism. Okay. Now, what's interesting, particularly when you look at how these things relate to today, is that most of Catholic philosophy and theology today is based upon realism. Now, there have been, William of Ockham was a Catholic. Peter Abelard was a Catholic. Now, many would say they were heretical or quasi-heretical Catholics. I'm not able to judge that. I believe William of Ockham was under some sort of penal restrictions at some point during his life by the church, and I know Abelard was too, either by the church, or I know he was very heavily persecuted by his lover's uncle. But anyway, these two thinkers were kind of, I guess you could say, they kind of have the roots of skepticism as well. They have the roots of skepticism because they kind of take everything that was posited before them, based upon Plato and Aristotle, and say, well, hey, let's think outside the box here. They kind of say, well, we can't really rely on these things, and it's not like they're people weren't relying on Plato and Aristotle as persons. They're relying upon, and not even just their ideas because they're connected to their persons, but they're relying on their ideas because they seem intimately connected to reality. Unless you get too far in your head, unless you think, if you think too much about thinking, you can start to divorce yourself from reality, and I would say solipsism is a good example of that. If you start to, think about, okay, how do I know things? How do I... Then, you start to kind of have some issues where you're not looking out of yourself anymore at what exists, but you're looking at, basically what your mind constructs as existing. So I would say there's some dangers there, and I think that's really the trap that William of Ockham fell into. He was trying to solve a problem uh, for the sake of religion, for the sake of the church. The problem that appeared to him, here's what it was. It was that realism and these concepts being out there seemed to be unprovable. He posited his famous Occam's razor, which says, the simplest explanation is the one that you should go with. And he considered realism, the saying that concepts are real, as being too complex. Mainly, in my understanding, because it's impossible to prove. Now, what's interesting, I would say, is that it's really impossible to prove either of these three things. They're basically like premises within an argument. You assume a premise. Now, often it's based upon evidence, but it's not proved by evidence, hardly ever, especially in deep theological and philosophical issues. These things aren't proved by evidence. They have evidence that can bolster them up, but there is no way of knowing them 100%. I mean, even, if you think in the case of solipsism, people often say, well, you know that a rock exists for 100%. Well, if you're someone who ascribes to solipsism, then you don't know that rock exists. I mean, you see what I mean? Like, pretty much in anything, you can break it down into skepticism if you want. It's just whether you want to do that or not. Do you want to live that way? Do you want to think that way? Live so isolated that you can't understand what's right in front of you? I would say that's kind of a fault of nominalism. Is it starts to think too much inside the head of humanity, of the person thinking, and I think the person can tie themselves up into knots. Now, it's a good question, that nominalism brings up. How do we prove that concepts exist? But ultimately, it's an unanswerable question. Just like, how do we prove concepts don't exist? You can't. Whenever you get into things that are this deep in philosophy, these deep premises of reality, it's impossible to prove them either way. So I would argue which one is most fitting. And not most fitting to you personally, but most fitting to the evidence we do have. It does seem that we're able to make connections between, saying a rock is a rock, whether it's large or small or rough or smooth. And it appears that, children have this ability even before they're able to name these things. So, that's what I would say is a good proof for realism. And I would kind of argue against nominalism with the logical fallacy of the slippery slope. Now, I get it. It's a logical fallacy. This isn't a great argument, but I think it is a good point. Once you start getting in your head this much, as does nominalism, and nominalism asks people to do, skepticism is just down the road. If you want to live like that, but I don't.